In today's episode, we will be discussing the wealth gap between Black and white families here in America. Before we get into this topic and this discussion for this podcast today, I want to make sure that you all like, subscribe, download, leave a rating and review. Please, if you like this podcast, if you like the content of the podcast, please leave a rating and review. Those help circulate the podcast and spread the podcast. They mean so much to me. So if you stop what you're doing right now, make sure you hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, hit the download button, and make sure you leave a rating and review. Okay. So back to today's episode. This is actually Black History Month. This episode will be airing on the last Tuesday in February. This episode actually brings a lot of emotions for me. It makes me a little sad. It makes me proud. It makes me think about change and what I can do. Being a podcaster in this financial space, being a black podcaster, a Black woman, I always think about, others and the next generation and how I'm doing my part. So going through this content, through these, actually, this is through years I've actually been learning this information. I remember just thinking about the wealth gap a few years ago and just thinking it was just only income. Like, oh yeah, like obviously, like we know that there's racial discrimination in hiring, in pay equality. So that's the reason between the wealth gap between Black and white median families. And, as I got older, as I started doing more research, learning about finances, learning about the history of investing, how investing affects the wealth, what drives wealth here in America. I learned that definitely was not the case, and it wasn't layered to just one thing. It's a lot of racial discriminations that lead and that continue to lead, and actually sadly continues to widen the gap of the wealth discrimination within here in America. And it makes me think, like I said, what can I do? And what I can do here on this platform as a podcaster is continue to educate. And that's what I'm going to do today. I'm going to be educating you all. So I think when you talk about racial gaps in America, you have to start with slavery. Slavery counted for about $246 million of the wealth in America, that as slaves, as descendants of slaves, wasn't equalized to that wealth. Just giving the labor in slavery, but had no ownership of land, no payments for their time, their labor, their sacrifice that built our nation's great economy, right? So when we look back, actually in 1965, as the Civil War was ending, President Abraham Lincoln at the time signed this Special Field Order number 15, which basically enlisted that families of slaves were able to have access to about 40 acres of land. He signed this pretty much the second day, on the day before his second inauguration. But this never really came to fruition for African Americans here in our country, because we shortly know that Abraham Lincoln was assassinated pretty much a few weeks after he signed this. Andrew Johnson quickly just reversed the order. It was basically white backlash. He actually stated that that order basically discriminated. There was demonstration was demonstrating of the whites, and it in favor the Negro, not thinking the the access that the white families got for got while in slavery, that wasn't accounted for. But it's crazy how history somehow seems to always repeats itself, because these are same kind of justifications we've heard in different aspects in our history with civil rights, Prop 209, affirmative action, right? This kind of backlash of it's not equal if we help blacks. So with that, the wealth of slavery, it stayed with the white family. Um, and as we know, what's the best thing about wealth? Wealth continues to grow, and it grows across generations. It makes me think about the Jay-Z song. I think it's the story of OJ. Yeah, when he talks about how he bought some art for 1 million. 2 years later, the is worth 8 million. Can't wait to give that blank to my kids. Right? You see that wealth really grows over time, and if we it makes me think about my own family. It makes me think about my grandmother, who actually bought her first home in 1967 here in Los Angeles, here in South Los Angeles. And I actually remember her telling me the story when she was alive, how she was living in like Sugar Hills, which at the time, if you know LA area landscape, basically is West Adams of today. And she shared that like she couldn't get a home there. And so she went to the neighborhood that she ended up buying here in South LA, and she bought that home for $14,500 in 1967. Um, and over time, with time, like that has that family, that house, she was able to pass down to my mother and my aunt, which is amazing. And that house, I don't even know the comps, but I'm sure just the area with gentrification, the boom of the rise with the stadium not too far here in LA. Yeah, that house is probably worth $500,000 today. And it's like the sacrifice that she did to get to that house, and every battle she had to get approved for that mortgage at that time. That's what I said. It makes me like very proud uh, to share that with you all um, today. So, getting a little emotional, but okay. So we know today, right, that the income and unemployment rate, and I'm sorry, not rate, the income and unemployment gap is higher for black families than it is for white families. So we see that, like I shared in my earlier example, you can obviously see that with inequality to our pay. Here in America, there's a lot of discrimination between the white man, black woman, different races, within just pay and our equality. And then when we think about employment and employment rate, extremely higher in black and Latino families and communities than it is with white families. And we even see that today as we are continuing to live in through this COVID pandemic. So when we look at wealth, you see that for the American middle class, basically the access to their wealth was 2/3 of it came from their primary residence. So that makes me think back of the example of my grandma. If you take the average white family that was able to do something very similar, in a white neighborhood, that home today, my generation's grandparents, maybe great grandparents, possibly still living at home, still access to that home can easily be 600, 700,000, depending on, where that home is here in America. Uh, so this New Deal, during this time, the New Deal, Franklin D. Roosevelt, our president at the time, uh, signed this during the Great Depression, and it was to give mortgages to Americans, to Americans at this time, giving them access to credit, right? Giving them the ability to build wealth. The New Deal went from 1933 to 1939, but it was strategically done and given through the Federal Housing Authority to not give loans in certain risky area. And if you look into your history of your major city, LA, in the 1930s, New York, Chicago, Philadelphia, you can literally see that they were on these maps, they were colored in red. So red meant risky, and red meant black families, black communities that were risky. So we have this, it's literally called redlining. So I definitely suggest you all, if you never heard about redlining, definitely Google, like I said, like historical maps, because you can literally see the communities that are literally in red, and they were the black communities at that time. So it's literally segregation. Not only just, we think about segregation, we know segregation affected all aspect of the black lives, but it affected to schooling for black families, the jobs they took, the homes they bought, the value in those homes, and uh, schooling for their children, right? Where their student, where they got their education, all was all was affected through segregation. So we have segregation, redlining, basically from the 1930s to the 1968, where we have President Lyndon B. Johnson, who has the Housing Fair Act, basically, that this is outlines cannot discriminate against uh, black blacks race for ownership. So rid of the policies that discriminated against black black blacks here in America. So now basically, between now we have the physical policies that say you can't discriminate. So we basically have that in at starting in 1968, right? So after that, uh there's still discrimination, but it's done in a way where it's not to the naked eye, as we've seen. So pretty much the 1970s to basically the 1990s, early 2000, and I'll stop before we get to 2008, we see a surge in subprime loans. So what subprime loans are, they're basically they were targeted to black families, that there are loans that start off cheap, but they get more expensive as the loan gets older. So um, even every 1 in 5 black families that went out to seek a mortgage, even if they had a good credit, they still end up with a subprime loan.
This is editing, Alana. And when I say credit, I mean credit score. So even if you had a good credit score.
This was a big case against actually Wells Fargo, because it was known that actually Wells Fargo was doing the practice of, they were sending their loan officers actually targeting black churches. So what they would do was have these wealth building seminars where they talk about how to purchase your home and mortgages, and it would basically be a way to sell black families these subprime loans, because they're selling them these bad loans, and then they're making money off of them and also not just on initially on the loan, on the interest, but as well as they're profiting if they lose their home as well with the subprime loans. So that's what makes it discriminating. But people didn't know this. People didn't know that they were getting these subprime loans because, they were getting this information, getting these loans through, through people, through churches there that they know. So they get referrals, right? So literally, like Wells Fargo was giving donations to these churches if they had someone from their congregation sign up for a loan. So the the it looks like it's a win-win. Like the community, the Black families are getting these home mortgages, and the church is getting a donation. um and then word of mouth, right? Your friend got this loan, went through this person, you can refer it to them next, and the cycle goes on and on and on and on and on. So then basically you have the crash of 2008, right, where Black communities lost about 53% of their wealth compared to uh, white families that maybe lost about 16% of their wealth, just due to the housing crisis and the housing crash of 2008, because, right, people were having these bad loans. And the narrative really was around this time was about people getting into the loans and they couldn't afford it, and that's on them. That was really the big narrative. And sadly, what happened was United States bailed out these banks. They had relief, but none of them really went to the people who was affected, the individual people, the Black families that got hurt through this, who lost their homes, right? um who lost their family homes potentially, right? Because we had this positive influx of Black families being able to buy homes from the 1970s to the 1990s, right? So these are generations that are maybe losing their homes, um, or multiple homes, from the first generation to the next generation in this time. So even though we see that the first 246 years, Blacks were the wealth of the U.S. economy because of slavery, then the next 100 years basically being discriminated from that wealth, and then today being discriminated from that wealth because of the backlash of these policies that was implemented. So then you think about just like resources and ability. Even if the median Black family income was the same as the median white family today, we lost that time, that compounded interest, that positive compounded interest of having access to wealth. That 300 years of never having that access to that land has created this large wealth, because that's really how wealth grow is through time. And our history basically blocked us from that time. So when people say like, well, how do you solve like the racial gap? It's like, that's such a loaded question, and it truly is a challenging question, and it's a hard question. I think it starts with a lot of things, but I think you have to acknowledge that this this wealth gap is 100 years of policies destroying the potential and the access to Black wealth. So, no, I don't have the answer to how we can solve the racial gap here in America, but I know I have to do everything in my power to try to strengthen and close that gap as much as I can humanly possible. So it makes me think about when you hear support Black business. Yes, continue to support Black businesses. Black businesses will allow jobs to come from them. It will help the Black dollar circulate in the Black community. So where our Black communities, cities and counties where our Black family, our Black neighborhoods reside, that money can be back invested into those schools, those resources in that community. It also leads to the opportunity of venture capital, right? We know capital, having access to money is needed, is necessary. You think about our most popular tech companies, Amazon, Facebook, Apple, those all started as solo entrepreneurs, one person with one great idea, having access and money to pursue that one idea. So we need companies, banks investing in these Black businesses, giving them capital to launch whatever the next Facebook, whatever the next Target, whatever it is, that is that is what's residing in the Black community, right? We need Black companies going public, like Airbnb did, right? Like when Tesla did, like all these big companies that are becoming public and being able to invest in stocks. We need Black owned businesses to get to that point. We need, we have ownership in the business. That was one ownership in real estate, right? And protecting real estate protection, estate planning, protecting what is ours, what is in our community, right? Making sure we're able to pass down that generational wealth to the next generation and the next generation. Have these conversations. Talk about the importance of this. Don't sell mom and dad's home. Why you don't do that, right? Why you don't want to do that? Because time is our greatest asset in wealth. So holding on to that real estate for years and years and years, you're able to give that to your children, and their children are able to give it to their children, etc. So we have to learn the key things that we need in our estate planning so we're able to properly pass down what we do own to the next generation, right? I think about a lot in the Black and Latino community about those who are banked and unbanked. Where do you see the most check cashing plays, payday loans? You see that in the Black and brown community. And we need people to be aware of that these ways and method to access money is costly. It's literally, to get a payday loan, it's like 32, 35%. Like, and we need to see those get away, and we need Black people reaching out, starting or connecting with their local credit unions, with their local Black banks. We need more Black banks. True, but that's another point. But connecting to institutions to have banking, to have checking, because a lot of the reasons is a lot of knowledge about just awareness about access to that and fees and et cetera. And it's perceived that banks are expensive, and it's costly to have your money hold in one place. So we got to get rid of that, because you need to have that relationship with these banks, because that will allow us to get finance later, get credit later. Yes, because we also just need to be credit positive, right? Sometimes, and this one's really hard because I think our FICO system and how we TransUnion, Equifax, all that, just how they determine your credit score is so horrible. It is so flawed, and I think I recently read that President Joe Biden is interested in finding a new solution. And I don't know too many details on it, but basically those companies are privately held companies, so maybe something having a little bit more government based, public based, to regulate credit, our credit bureau system, or having this complete new system. So I think there's probably more to come in the next few years to see about that. But yeah, it's so horrible, because it's pretty much like you have to do these things that no one really talks about, no one really knows. I mean, I went really in depth in one of my past episode, about how to leverage credit smartly. So I definitely suggest you check that out if you haven't, about ways you can lever credit, but it's hard if it's not access to you. So you can be doing the right things, you can be paying your rent on time, you can be paying all your bills on time, have no debt, don't have a credit card, and you're not seen as credit worthy. And so you lose that access to tap into to ownership, through home owners. I mean, through home ownership. So yeah, a lot of things, that can probably contribute to. There's a lot of things that probably can contribute that I haven't even mentioned that can try to lessen that wealth gap. The biggest thing is we got to educate, we got to teach each other, we have to lift each other up, and we have to support each other. So I definitely can't depend on sadly can't depend on the government, but there's definitely needs to be policies ensured to support, um, Black families getting home grants, getting access, to that, um, appreciating their wealth in their community. I think about gentrification and how crazy that is how communities were redlined and couldn't couldn't literally, buy homes in white neighborhoods. So a lot of black families bought in their neighborhood, and now those same areas are seek from those white, like, wealthy people who have that generational wealth, who can afford to buy for them that looks like a cheaper rate, um, and have wealth and equity into their new situation or new home that's in the same Black community. Think about Brooklyn, what happened in Brooklyn, how that got completely bed stock gentrified. It's literally happening here in Inglewood, here in Los Angeles, here in South Los Angeles. So yeah, it's one of those things where it's a challenge to talk about. It's even making me emotional talking about it. Um, but at the end of the day, I think that's why, even though it's hard, and even though it's not an easy conversation to talk about, this is something we have to share. Like, we got to know. So we got to continue to fight, continue to push our policymakers, to support the Black interest, the black families, to our education, to our systems, like everything, all aspects of our life, our healthcare here. So yeah, I think I'm in on that note. Makes me just think back, like I said, makes me I actually want to end on one of my favorite quotes from actually Martin Luther King. And it's in his book, Why We Can't Wait. And if you ever have thought about just racial gaps or inequality and ever question a Black person's why or say anything negative or how come, think about this quote. The average Negro is born into want and deprivation. His struggle to escape his circumstance is hindered by color discrimination. He is deprived of normal education and normal social and economic opportunities. When he seeks opportunity, he is told, in effect, to lift himself by his own bootstraps, advice which he does not take account the fact that he is barefoot. Remember that. Remember that quote. Remember that quote. Black people, we are barefoot. Barefoot. And with that, I'm saying let's teach each other. Let's uplift each other. Let's grow together. And let's get to this bag. This real wealth bag. And this is the Wise Finances Podcast. Like, subscribe, comment, leave a rating and review. And I can't wait to see y'all and talk to y'all next week.